Hello, philosophers. Today I'd primarily like to give you some thoughts regarding the 7 philosophers covered in our text, Philosophy in 7 Sentences. But before I do so, I want to begin by reading for you a quote from C.S. Lewis in his introduction to a translation of Athanasius's On the Incarnation. So C.S. Lewis writes, "For my own part, I tend to find the doctrinal books often more helpful in devotion than the devotional books. And I rather suspect that the same experience may await many others. I believe that many who find that nothing happens when they sit down or kneel down to a book of devotion would find that the heart sings unbidden while they are working their way through a tough bit of theology with a pipe in their teeth and a pencil in their hand." Tobacco use aside, I think C.S. Lewis is making an awfully profound point here. The reason why we are so often discontent in our studies, discontent in our spirituality, discontent in our lives is because we are contenting ourselves lazily with the superficial. We like to read short, light Twitter devotionals in order to gain a sense of spirituality without actually digging deep into the roots of what theology, what spirituality, what life fundamentally is, when in reality we were made for the ultimate. That is, we are made to reflect God. We are made to be grounded in significance itself. And so the disconnect between what we are designed to be and what we content ourselves with very often will result in despair, whether or not that's actively realized at all times. And so I would encourage you, as God's image bearers, who are made to reflect truth, who are made to pursue God's wisdom, I would encourage you to think deeply and to be willing to humbly but bravely encounter the great minds of the past. I know it can be intimidating to approach philosophers themselves and instead content yourselves with what is provided in introductory philosophy books such as the ones that we are reading for this course. And they can be a great start, but I would encourage you to engage with the full, unabridged text that have shaped our world. And this is something we can do when we recognize that the great minds of the past, great as they may be, are not fundamentally different than we are. That is, they, like us, were made in the image of God and use their rational capabilities in the pursuit of truth. And sometimes they were successful, and sometimes they weren't. But either way, we can learn a great deal by engaging with those who have gone before us. And so, even though I'm not requiring any full original text for this introduction class, I would encourage you on your own to pursue wisdom and to do some reading. Now, if I could recommend just one place to get started with this, I would perhaps recommend that you pick up a copy of Plato's 5 Dialogues. Plato, of course, wrote many dialogues, but these texts, the Euthyphro, Apology, Credo, Meno, and Phaedo, they comprise together the series of events referred to as the trial and death of Socrates. So this not only provides some foundational ideas that obviously left an impression on Plato, but it's also one of the places we can go to kind of get a handle of the historical Socrates, who was so significant, not necessarily for the things that he posited, but more for the questions he asked and the way that he reasoned. That is, he reasoned in a fundamentally philosophical manner, asking questions, trying to get at the essence of things. And also, the Platonic dialogues are simply interesting, they're entertaining, they're engaging to read. As we gain philosophy in narratival, in story form, and so that way we're able to reason along with the characters used in the dialogues, which provides for a more meaningful experience than some of the blander philosophical texts that have emerged over time. And so I strongly recommend that you pick this up and give it a read. All right, so one last thing before I begin discussing the philosophers covered in our text. I want to lay out some basic Greek ideas that are not covered in the text, but are very significant for setting the stage for subsequent Western philosophy, and it'll help to draw some lines between the philosophers discussed in our text. So the first thing that I want to discuss is the Greek question of being and becoming. I think the best way to get a handle on this dilemma is to ask you a question. What is it that makes something the same thing even through the process of change. Like, for example, of course, we as individuals are constantly undergoing changes. We age, our cells are replaced. Over time, we undergo all kinds of different physical changes. Yet what is it about us that remains the same throughout time? If all of our cells are replaced, then are we in fact the same person? Well, you might be inclined to say, okay, well, sure, even though our physical bodies are constantly in a state of change, we have a soul, and our soul remains constant throughout our various processes of change. However, does that comport with Christian theology? Well, I would say certainly not, because, of course, we believe that we are being sanctified. And so even our souls are in a state of reform, a state of process until completion in glory. And so with that in mind, are you the same person as you were yesterday? If you answer yes, which of course would be your natural response, the answer is why? What about you is the same? The pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus famously said that you cannot step into the same river twice. And of course, this is because once you step out of the river and then step back in, you're now in new water. And he says this is how it is with all of existence. Everything is in a constant state of change. Nothing remains the same. Now, Heraclitus recognized that this is a troubling reality because if nothing stays the same, then the ideas that we have in our mind can never properly correlate with the way things fundamentally are. And that's because, excuse this abstract language, but because nothing is. Everything is becoming. Therefore, our minds cannot possibly catch up with reality, so to speak. However, he thought about this and then recognized there actually is something that stays the same, and that is the process of change itself. The river may always be moving, but the river is always moving in a consistent and predictable manner. And so this force of stability in the process of change he referred to as the Word. That is, in Greek, the Logos. And so the Logos is the force of consistency in this world of change. However, this does not really solve Heraclitus' dilemma, because as we might be inclined to identify his Logos with God, especially in light of John 1, right? In the beginning was the Word, en arche hen ho Logos. However, for Heraclitus, the Logos is not distinct from this world of change. He is a monist, meaning he believes that all of reality is fundamentally in one plane of existence, which of course is different from the Christian position, in which case we have a dualism between God the Creator and then creation. They are fundamentally different, whereas for Heraclitus, they are one and the same. Therefore, Heraclitus, his position is not logically valid. It is self-defeating, because if everything is in a process of change and everything fundamentally is one, then the Logos itself must be in a state of change, in which case he loses any grounding for consistency. And so, in conclusion on this point of thought, for Heraclitus, everything is in a state of change. Everything is in a state of flux, and he has no valid way of getting around that. Well, on the opposing side from Heraclitus, we have Parmenides, who actually said that nothing changes, but that change, that movement, is simply an illusion, but rationally speaking, change is impossible. This philosophy was illustrated well by Zeno and some of his paradoxes. And so one of Zeno's paradoxes involved a race between Achilles and a tortoise. So the tortoise gets a head start because obviously it's much slower than Achilles, and so the tortoise begins the race. A little bit later, Achilles is able to start the race himself. Now, before Achilles can catch up with the tortoise, he first must cross half of the distance between the starting line and the tortoise. Now, in order to close the gap further, he must first cross half of the remaining distance, and so forth, and so forth, and so forth, into infinity. Therefore, according to Zeno, Achilles can never actually catch up with the tortoise. And he had a few others like this. For example, you have an archer who shoots a bow, or rather he shoots with a bow, he shoots an arrow. Now, before the arrow can reach its destination, it must first travel half the way between the bow and its destination. In order to go the remaining way, it must first go half of the remaining distance, and so forth and so forth. Therefore, it can never reach its target. Now, if you narrow down the scope of these paradoxes, then it becomes evident that no movement whatsoever is rationally possible. Therefore, it's all an illusion. In actuality, nothing could possibly ever change. And so, on one hand, we have Heraclitus, who represents the philosophy of becoming. On the other hand, we have Parmenides, who represents the philosophy of being. And the Greeks had a very difficult time figuring out how being and becoming could possibly be reconciled. And so, keep this conversation in the back of your mind, and we will refer to it from time to time as we go through our philosophers from 7 sentences. And so the first philosopher that we're given is Protagoras, who's given the sentence, "Man is the measure of all things." And so Protagoras was a sophist, which, as our text indicates, means that he was essentially a rhetorician for hire. It was often said of the sophists, and in fact, this accusation was even brought against Socrates at his trial, that the sophists would make the better arguments the worst and the worst arguments the better. And so the sophists weren't necessarily grounded in any distinct worldview, but instead were something like rhetorical mercenaries. And so when Protagoras says, man is the measure of all things, he's making the point that there is no objective truth that we are measured against, but instead our beliefs are the measurement for truth. In other words, in Protagoras, we get a basic relativism that is, of course, quite common today. Whenever you hear the statement, "You be you, live your truth, follow your heart," these are all statements in the tradition of Protagoras. And of course, there is a glaring logical problem with this view, and this is illustrated well by Socrates. So in Plato's dialogue, Protagoras, he has Socrates speaking with Protagoras. And at one point, Socrates asks Protagoras, "What do you do for a living?" Protagoras says, "I'm a teacher." And Socrates responds by saying something like, "Well, I find this terribly puzzling, because once you tell your students, man is the measure of all things, that is, whatever you believe is already as good as what I believe, well, I don't know what else you could possibly teach them." And so we see that the espousal of relativism, the espousal of sophistry, is self-defeating. Because if each individual truly is their own standard of truth, then as soon as I tell somebody else that they are wrong, well, now I'm imposing my truth against their truth, and according to Protagoras' own philosophy, I have no right to do that, because you are the measure of all things just as much as I am the measure of all things. Therefore, the espousal of a relativized truth is fundamentally self-defeating. This runs into the same problem as the nihilist who says that there is no truth, because then, of course, the question is that statement true? And I recognize that some may accuse me of fighting against straw man arguments right now, but I'm making what I believe is a pretty profound point, and that is, if a statement regarding the nature of truth cannot apply to itself, then it is an absurdity. That is, if there truly is no truth, that statement cannot possibly be true. If all truth is determined by the individual, then that is not a universally binding truth. And so, our statement about the nature of truth must be able to account for itself. Thus we can confidently say that if Protagoras is right, if every man truly is the measure of all things, then it's not true that every man is the measure of all things, and thus we have a logical contradiction at the root of our worldview. Okay, next philosopher we have Socrates, who famously said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." And of course we don't have any writings from Socrates, and so we're dependent on others, primarily Plato, to tell us about Socrates. But from what we can tell, Socrates did not necessarily have a great deal to posit. Socrates' claim to fame was more in the questions that he asked. And so he would go around to the leading supposed experts asking questions like, what is justice? What is virtue? Or what is piety? As he asked Euthyphro. In fact, as our text indicates, Socrates was known as the gadfly of Athens. And of course, a gadfly is this insect that bites and kind of annoys animals. And so Socrates was kind of annoying because, of course, people like feeling confident in their knowledge. People like feeling confident in their wisdom. People like feeling like they are the measure of all things. And so when that's questioned, typically people will not respond in a positive manner. In fact, he did not only question others, but he very much questioned himself. I mean, the oracle at Delphi told him that he was the wisest man in the world. And of course, Socrates had a difficult time with this because he didn't believe he knew anything. And this is precisely what made him so wise. He recognized that he was not the measure of all things, but that there is a transcendent wisdom, there is a transcendent truth that he must aspire to. And so he would examine his life, he would question his life to see whether or not he was truly in pursuit of this wisdom. And this gets to his understanding of humanity. As Plato would say, to be human is to be capable of intellect. That is to rationally apprehend transcendent ideals of truth, of wisdom. And so for Socrates, what makes humanity, what encompasses human life, is the pursuit of wisdom, which we come to understand as we examine ourselves and then seek to ground ourselves in a transcendent wisdom. And so here we start to get hints at how the dilemma of being and becoming will be met. That here we are in this process of becoming something, but we can become a meaningful something as we seek a transcendent wisdom that rises above this world of change. And this, of course, will really come to a focus in the thought of Plato, who unfortunately and curiously is not distinctly covered in our text. And so I'm just going to very briefly touch on Plato. And so, as I just alluded to through Socrates, Plato gives us an attempt at solving the dilemma between being and becoming. So with Heraclitus, Plato says that everything in this world of experience is indeed in a process of change. But Plato believed that above this world of change, you have this world that he called the world of the forms. This is a world, a reality, that's separate from this world of change, that stands above it as a stable ideal. And so think of this as like the unmoving blueprint for the actual realities down here. And so up here, you have ontological frameworks of humanity, of even things like horseness, that is the idea of a horse, right? That's up here in the world of change. And then down here, you have actual horses. And this gives us a framework for understanding goodness and evil. And so, say, up here, you have what a good, a perfect human is. Okay, down here, we have actual, particular humans that almost necessarily fall short of the ideal. Well, the differentiation between the ideal and the actual is evil. And so to put this in a Christian framework, the form, the ideal of humanity is image bearer of God. And as much as we fall short of that form, of that ideal, we are evil. That would be the gap between the form and the particular reality. And so with Parmenides, Plato would say that there is indeed a world of absolute stability, this unchanging reality, but then there is also this world of change that is in the constant process of change, as Heraclitus would say. And so in Plato, we get being up here, and we get becoming down here. And the becoming is constantly striving to imitate being, even if it never gets quite there. Now, for Plato, what makes humans unique compared to, say, the other animals is that we not only live down here in this world of change, but through our minds, we're capable of understanding this world of being up here, this world of ideas, this world of ideals. Now, for Plato, the reality is we're not actually discovering the ideals when we apprehend them, we're more remembering them. Now, scholars debate exactly what Plato believed about this, but nonetheless, Plato at least theorized a doctrine of reincarnation, that is, that the immortal soul of humanity passes on through the cycle of death and rebirth. And he theorized that between these life cycles, the soul had direct access to the forms, and then through the trauma of incarnation, essentially forgot it. But nonetheless, that immediate knowledge of the forms is still there, it's just been suppressed. And so whenever we learn truths, whenever we apprehend the forms, he says we're not actually learning them, it's more that we are remembering them. So because of humanity's unique experience to understand the forms, and beyond that, to actually experience the forms in this pre-incarnate state, humanity can be said to uniquely live in both worlds, the world of the forms as well as the world of change. They are met together in the human experience. Okay, so the next philosopher that we're given is Aristotle, who denied the idea of the transcendent forms, at least in the same sense that Plato affirmed them. He denied this doctrine of truth or form remembrance, and instead said that knowledge essentially begins with empirical experience, that is, with sense data, and then from that sense data we then abstract the essence of what a thing is. And for example, there's no transcendent, detached form of hoarseness. Instead, we encounter with our senses all these various animals that bear these similarities. We abstract these essential similarities, then say, here's what a horse is. And so in contrast to Plato's top-down model of truth, Aristotle has very much a bottom-up model. And this, of course, is displayed well in Raphael's School of Athens. And so you can see here that Plato is pointing up because, again, he is a top-down model of truth, whereas Aristotle has his hand kind of horizontal, that is sort of pushing down because he has this bottom-up model. And so for Aristotle, humanity is defined as the rational animal. This is why the sentence he's given is, all men by nature desire to know. It is our nature. It is the essence of humanity to be rational, to understand, to comprehend, to pursue truth and reason. And I think to briefly introduce you to Aristotle, I think it would be helpful to provide for you his framework of causation. So he believed that everything can be analyzed according to four causes. So first you have the formal cause. This would essentially be the essence of what something is. And so the formal cause for a house perhaps could be something like the blueprint, right? It's the design for that thing. Okay, next you have the material cause. This would be the material components that make up the thing. So again, in the case of the house, material cause might be the bricks, the wood, drywall, that sort of thing. Okay, next you have the efficient cause. This would be what brings about the thing. And so the efficient cause of a house might be the builders. Okay, and then you have the final cause. The final cause refers to what a thing is meant for. This would get at the Greek word telos, purpose, meaning, significance. What is it for? And so the final cause of a house would be to be lived in, to be inhabited. And so these would be the four causes provided by Aristotle. Okay, now let's take this Aristotelian breakdown and apply it to his understanding of the human. Now for Aristotle, the formal cause is actually the soul, because that's what gives structure to human life. And by the soul, he essentially meant the rational potential of a human. Right? This is what separates us from the animals, our human soul. This is what gives us the potential for rationality. Material cause would then be our flesh and blood and organs and bones and whatnot. Our efficient cause would be our parents. And then our final cause would be the fulfillment of our formal cause. That is to think, to reason, to use rationality. And so for Aristotle, to be a good human is to think. And this is what everything about humanity is pointed towards reason, towards rationality. And so for Aristotle, as well as most of the classical Greek world, there is a telos built into the nature of a thing. That is, everything in nature, including humanity, exists for a purpose. And so to be a good, whatever we're talking about, is to fulfill that purpose well. And so for Aristotle, to be a good human is to be a creature of reason, a creature of rationality. Thus, all men, by nature, desire to know, even if we don't necessarily fulfill that nature. And so for Aristotle, we are in a process of becoming, but stability is found in the good. And again, unlike Plato, for Aristotle, the good is not up in this transcendent world of ideals, but the good is the fulfillment of form, the fulfillment of essence. Okay, next we have Augustine, who famously said, "You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." Now, Augustine is one of my favorites because he is fundamentally grounded in Christian thought, but he's able to appropriate, to kind of baptize some thought patterns from the pagan world, and especially from Platonism. And so Augustine believes with Plato that there is this world of transcendent forms, of transcendent goodness in particular, but that these forms aren't just sort of floating around in this ethereal ether, but that the forms are found in the mind of God. And so, as we pursue truth, we are actually pursuing the Christian God, from whom all truth originates. And so for Augustine, truth, goodness, and beauty come from God, are apprehended through our understanding of this world, and then direct us back to the source, that is, back to God. As Paul says of Christ, all things were created through him and for him. As Paul says in Romans 1, that God's attributes are revealed in the world, and as we apprehend that reality, we are then brought back to a proper understanding of the originator of this world, of the originator of the design of this world. So as beings that are uniquely capable of recognizing God's presence in this world, our telos, our final cause in Aristotelian terms, is found in a proper understanding of our God. And because this is our design, a failure to carry out the function of our design results in a certain futility, to use Paul's language, or in a restlessness, as Augustine might say, a restlessness that can only be brought to rest when we fulfill our purpose, when we fulfill our telos, when our final cause matches our form. Now, there is so much I could say about Augustine, but for the purposes of what we're doing, I'll go ahead and move on to our next thinker. That is Descartes, who famously said in his Discourse on Method, "Cogito ergo sum." I think, therefore, I am. Now, Descartes is really what begins the philosophical era known as modernity. Now, where modernity really breaks from the previous age is that whereas Christian philosophy had historically began with God, and then from who God is, we come to a proper understanding of who we are, modernity reverses that. Descartes is going to make his foundation, not God, but himself, and then from his own reason, he will then come to affirm God. And so even though Descartes is a Christian philosopher, he attains a distinctly different position than his Christian predecessors. So as the scientific revolution is in the works and the Aristotelian view of the physical world is crumbling, Descartes is in a time of crisis, and he wants to develop a philosophical system that could not even possibly be doubted. And so in order to do this, he's going to begin by doubting everything he could possibly doubt. And so in his Meditations on First Philosophy, he runs through the series of meditations of doubt. And so he recognizes that very often his sense experiences deceive him, right? Perhaps you're out in a crowd and you think you see somebody you know, and then you eventually realize it wasn't that person at all. Okay, you were deceived by your senses. Or also, what if you're dreaming, right? It's possible that right now you're actually asleep and you're just imagining this world around you. Okay, so that's a possibility. He also theorizes that, okay, what if the thoughts in my head aren't even my own? What if they're being fed to me by some evil demon? So that's always a possibility. And of course, if you've seen The Matrix, you see where those ideas originally came from. So anyways, he goes through this whole process of doubt, doubting everything that could possibly be doubted until he arrives at a singular truth. He recognizes that precisely because he's thinking, because he is doubting, he must exist in some capacity. Now, he might not exist in the way that he thinks he exists. That is, he might not be a human. Maybe he's just a disembodied mind somewhere. But regardless, the one thing that cannot be doubt is that he's doubting, that he's thinking. And that means that because he's thinking, he knows that he, in some sense, must exist. Now, based off his own existence, he then goes through a series of kind of apologetical arguments as to how he can prove that God exists, and then if God exists, then he can at least mostly trust that he is constructed in such a way that he can properly understand the world, therefore he can know things. And I'm not right now going to trace all his arguments, but more than anything, I want you to see his philosophical methodology, that Descartes' foundation, his bedrock of truth on which he builds everything else, is himself, that he exists. And so now, unlike Augustine, his philosophy, Descartes' philosophy, is not going to begin with God, it's going to begin with himself. And then from his own existence, he then reasons his way to God. And this is a significant turn, because now we've moved away from a theocentric, a God-centered way of doing philosophy, and now we've shifted to an anthropocentric view of doing philosophy. That is a man-centered view. And so, even though Descartes is arguing for objective truth, we see that fundamentally his methodology has a great deal in line with Protagoras. And so, Descartes, in his supposed truth for indubitable objectivity, is actually paving the way for postmodernism, which we'll get to later on, which is essentially the revival of Protagoras. So anyways, that is Descartes. So next we have Blaise Pascal, the great scientist, philosopher, theologian, who is given the sentence, "The heart has its reasons of which reason knows nothing." So I greatly appreciate what Pascal has to say about the heart. Now, on the most explicitly theological angle, he has a great deal in line with Augustine, who of course said that our hearts are restless until they rest in God. And in a very similar line of thought, Pascal says, as is provided in our text, "What else does this craving and this helplessness proclaim, but that there was once in man a true happiness, of which all that now remains is the empty print and trace. This he tries in vain to fill with everything around him, seeking in things that are not there the help that he cannot find in those that are. Though none can help, since this infinite abyss can be filled only with an infinite, an immutable object, in other words, by God himself." And so again, we are made in the image of God. The fulfillment of our form is in the reflecting of the image of God, that is, the reflecting upon God himself. And when we do not fulfill this form, but when we seek some other end, some other telos, then our design, or not our design, but rather our functionality is thwarted. And this results in a deep restlessness, a drinking of salt water in order to quench our thirst, yet we know what the result of that is. And so we are made for God, and we cannot rest until we rest in God. On more epistemological grounds, that is, regarding the nature of truth and the basis of our reasoning, he settles the problems of doubt in a way that I think far surpasses the method of Descartes. Unlike Descartes, Pascal recognizes that there are certain realities that we can't reason to, but actually must be presupposed as the foundation of our reasoning. And so again, provided in the text, this great passage. "We know the truth not only through our reason, but also through our heart. It is through the latter that we know first principles, and reason, which has nothing to do with it, tries in vain to refute them. The skeptics have no other objection than that, and they work at it to no purpose. We know that we are not dreaming, but, however unable we may be to prove it rationally, our inability proves nothing but the weakness of our reason, and not the uncertainty of all our knowledge, as they maintain. For knowledge of first principles, like space, time, motion, number, is as solid as any derived through reason, and it is on such knowledge compelling from the heart and instinct that reason has to depend and base all its argument." In other words, for Pascal, We can't begin with reason alone in order to justify our reasoning, but our reason must be grounded in deeper realities, that is, in a deeper reality, in reality itself, which ultimately is found in God. And so, with Augustine, Pascal would say that fundamental reality, truth, goodness, beauty, these things are rooted in God and then implanted in the souls of humans. And so with this divine knowledge implanted in our souls, we then reason from this knowledge in a way that ultimately directs us back to the source of that knowledge, which is God. In other words, reason is grounded in a theocentric worldview rather than emerging from an anthropocentric worldview. And so with Pascal, we, in many ways, get a step away from modernity back to sort of a neo-Augustinianism. So our next and last philosopher that we're given in the text is Soren Kierkegaard, who is another one of my favorites, and I'm currently in the midst of my doctoral dissertation on some Kierkegaardian psychology, so I could talk about him for quite some time, but I'll try to keep this brief and to the point. Now, I do want to begin by saying that Kierkegaard, I believe, is one of the most misunderstood philosophers, perhaps especially by evangelicals, who often accuse him of being a subjectivist, that is, a relativist, somewhat in the line of Protagoras, but that's most certainly not the case. And this is why it's important to understand something about the context of the philosophers that we study. Kierkegaard lived under the Danish Lutheran Church, which stressed orthodoxy to the neglect of lived Christian experience. Just as is typically the case in established Christendom, right? If you're born into the state church, then it's just assumed that you are a Christian by virtue of your citizenry in the nation, in the Christian nation. And of course, this is not how it works, and so Kierkegaard wanted to stress the subjective, that is the lived, the experiential element of the Christian faith, so that we don't simply affirm the creed, we don't simply affirm Christ, but as Kierkegaard would say, we were contemporaneous with Christ. That is, we had a lived, personal, ongoing, present experience with Christ rather than just a knowledge of the doctrine of Christ. And so while it may be true that Kierkegaard would sometimes go into rhetorical excesses in order to prove his point that might not be appropriate in our current time, he was making an important point that needed to be made during the time in which he lived. Okay, that aside, the quote that we're given is, "The greatest hazard of all, losing oneself, can occur very quietly in the world, as if it were nothing at all." It's one of my favorite and perhaps most straightforward Kierkegaardian texts. This is short discourse entitled, "To Need God is a Human Being's Greatest Perfection," in which he argues for precisely that to be essentially human is to be grounded in God. And when we try to ground ourselves in the world of change, when we try to ground ourselves in Heraclitus' river, we are doomed to lose ourselves, because if we attach ourselves to the process of change, well then, we're no longer a stable reality, but we're being pulled to and fro by the various forces of process, of change. And this will lead to restlessness. This will lead to despair, which is a very important Kierkegaardian term that I've already used from time to time because I wanted to see the continuity in some of these ideas that we're talking about. That when we attempt to break from our nature, when we attempt to move away from our telos, the contrast between what we are in essence and what we are in practice manifests itself in despair, in this gross incongruity, in this deep restlessness. And so, for Kierkegaard, this is despair. However, the possibility of having a stable kind of existence, an existence grounded in what we fundamentally are, manifests itself in anxiety. Now, for Kierkegaard, anxiety is not exactly the same thing that we mean today in the realm of clinical psychology. For Kierkegaard, anxiety is a deeply spiritual reality. It's this it's a simultaneous attraction to and fear of what we could be as humans. And so, futilely grounded as we are in process, attached to things in this moving world, We know we could be so much more. Yet, that glorious reality of what it means to be a human, anchored in the infinitely glorious God, well, that's appealing, but it's also kind of scary. So sometimes humans will courageously and relying entirely on the grace of God achieve that reality of what we could be. But very often, out of fear, we repel from that. We try to keep that reality out of our minds and push all the more into this world of change, resulting in deeper and deeper despair. And so, for Kierkegaard, as for Augustine, as for Pascal, as for many of these other thinkers, for Kierkegaard, the goal of human experience is in resting in and being grounded in the eternal, unmoving God, who then gives infinite significance to the world of change as we experience it now. Because when we are anchored in God, well then suddenly the world that we experience itself gets some anchoring. And so we find that through our relationship with God, we have a context for being that then gives stable significance and meaning to our experience of becoming. And as Paul said in Athens, which, by the way, is no coincidence, in him we live and move and have our being. As he says to the Colossians, in Christ all things were created, and through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things are held together. May we walk in wisdom. Amen.